if you haven't yet. You start your tomato seeds soon. So there's so much to know about tomatoes that it is impossible to do in an hour. So when Cindy and I were talking about tomato talks for Peters, we decided to do 2 of them. And this is the first one, and I subtitled it Seed to Soil. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today. Getting tomato from seed where it is ready to plant in the garden. Then the next talk in the beginning of June will be from soil to harvest. And that's the one with the diseases and the pests and the staking and the pruning and when to harvest and cat facing and what do you do? What's the breaker stage anyway? And all of that stuff. So this is me. Well, this is part of me. So to pay for my gardening habit, I teach biochemistry and cell biology at W&J, among other things. And that's one way to reach me, through my W&J email. And in my real life, I'm Farmer Candy at Chickadee Cottage Micro Farm. And that's another way to email recently. So if you don't get a rapid reply, I haven't quite trained myself to check it every day yet. As you can tell, my affair with tomatoes goes way back. That's me at about age 8 and my father in our backyard. And those are probably big boy tomatoes, which I don't grow. But we'll talk a little bit about that variety. And that table and one of the benches lives at the moment in my basement, and that's the table I use for all my seed starting. So it has seen a lot of tomatoes in various life stages across its surface, still in use. So there's so much to know about tomatoes. And when I started thinking about how to organize this talk and how to turn it not into just here's a litany of vocabulary words. But I knew there were vocabulary that you needed to know and details about tomatoes that you had to understand to be as effective a grower and a consumer as possible. So one way that, the way that I decided to break it up was to actually introduce a lot of these topics and details about tomatoes in the context of things that you need to know and the questions you need to ask yourself before you get started growing. So I have but those are mine. Okay, the uncredited. So there you go. So how do you get to that point? And there are a lot of questions that you should ask yourself about what and why before you actually get started growing or even buying those seeds, even if you're a seed hoarder like I am. So I'll walk you through these 6 questions and in the process, teach you something about tomatoes and how tomatoes grow. And then we'll get to the second part, which is really about growing from seed to soil. So one first question to ask yourself is how much space do you have? That's going to really determine which type of tomatoes you can grow and of course how many you can grow. But space can be a really limiting factor, and the amount of space different tomato varieties take is very different. So there are really 2 aspects to consider. One is the determinate versus indeterminate. And the other is whether you want standard or dwarf tomatoes. So first, determinate versus indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes are the ones that are commonly grown by commercial growers. That doesn't mean the backyard gardener, the small farmer can't. But the important aspect of determinate tomatoes is that they set most of their fruit and ripen it in a very short period of time. So you're going to have a big harvest over maybe 2 to 3 weeks. These are not the tomatoes that are going to be giving you a few tomatoes a day all season. And the reason they set their fruit like this is that the flowers and the fruit are at the end of the stems. So it limits their ability to grow. So that means they don't get very tall. So all of the worries about staking reaching to the top of the 10-foot tomato isn't happening with the determinants. They're gonna top out at maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. More bushy, these are the ones that you could probably put in a tomato cage for support and not need to stake or trellis or whatever. But you really have to realize that you're not gonna have tomatoes all season. You're gonna have a lot come in a short amount of time. Now, if you're doing a lot of processing, if you're doing a lot of canning, making a lot of salsa, a lot of spaghetti sauce, whatever, you want to freeze a lot, these would be a great choice. And that's why commercial growers really focus a lot on the determinate varieties. The ones that you're probably familiar with are the indeterminate ones. These are the vining ones. These are the ones that set the flowers and fruit off to the sides of the stem. It does not limit their growth. So these are the ones that can get 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet tall or more. They're more vining. And you're going to get a few of them at a time ripening in succession. From when they start, it might be early July. And maybe if the pests and diseases are friendly, you had a good year, up to frost. So these are the ones that you commonly find in the backyard grower garden. Here they are. Determinate or indeterminate. That's one of the first things a person will ask or will tell you. So how do you want your harvest? A lot in a short time or a few spread out over a long time? How big do you want those tomatoes to be? Those indeterminate ones, the viney ones, can get 10, 12 feet or more. You can limit them somewhat by pruning, but you're still going to have to deal with a much larger plant. The determinate ones, shoulder high maybe, if that. So that's another space aspect. There are also a lot of dwarf market now. There was a big dwarf tomato breeding project that's been going on for about 12 or 15 years that has introduced dozens of dwarf varieties to the market, and they're 2 to 3 feet. So they would be great for containers on a patio, on the deck, whatever. And they're actual micro dwarfs that get 13 inches tall. Right? So literally like a little flower pot sized tomato. Now, obviously, you're not going to get the same number of tomatoes, the same volume, the same poundage of tomatoes, but there are options for tomato in all different amounts of space that you have to devote to them. So how much space will determine whether you use a determinate or indeterminate, standard size or dwarf. Another question is, what do you want to use those tomatoes for? Or to put it more grammatically, how are you going to use the tomatoes? And you really kind of break it down into 2 areas. One is fresh eating. That's the slice it up and put it on the BLTs, sorry, vegetarians. Slice it up and put it in the salad, right? Or processing. That's cutting it up and freezing it, cutting it up and canning it, cooking it into sauce. In which case, having a lot of juice and a lot of seeds is often a problem or a detriment in that you got to cook a lot longer, for instance. So for fresh eating, the typical types that are grown are the big beef steaks. Okay, so these are the ones that can hang over the sides of the sandwich bread. Also slicers, which are typically a little smaller than those big beef steaks, but more uniform in size. Because they're kind of mid-size, more rounded tomatoes. And then a lot of people like in their salad, the snack, the cherry or the grape tomatoes, okay, or even the plum tomatoes, more elongated shapes. These are the ones that we think of as the fresh eating. For processing, then you're thinking the paste tomatoes and also some of the saladette tomatoes. The difference with these is they tend to have a lot less juice. So they're meatier. They often have fewer seeds. That those cavities in the tomatoes that are called locules are smaller. And that means that if you're using these paste tomatoes, these saladette tomatoes to make sauce or whatever, off as much liquid to thicken it. That's a big advantage for processing. So that's another question. What type of tomato, in addition to what's the kind of plant's growth habit, what type of fruit are you going to get off of that? And why are you growing this? Is your top priority taste? Or is your top priority production and yield? Not saying that these paste tomatoes can't taste great, but the ones that people rave about and fall in love with are usually the heirlooms that aren't the ones that people grow for processing, for making the spaghetti sauce and such, are usually the hybrid tomatoes that are higher yielding, but might not have the same degree, the same boldness or distinctiveness of flavor as the heirlooms. So that brings me, of course, to the difference between an heirloom and a hybrid. The heirlooms, the big distinct thing about heirlooms is that they were bred naturally. They're grown without crossbreeding. People are not taking pollen from one plant and putting on the stigma of another plant and making human-made crosses. These are allowed to cross naturally, and people have selected them, taken the best ones, saved the seeds, and passed them down for generations. So the heirloom. They're referred to as open pollinated or OPs because of that lack of human intervention in the breeding. Selection, yes, but humans aren't making the crosses to fertilize the plant and make the fruit. They're also generally defined as that existed prior to 1949. And the reason 1949 is such a cutoff for many people is that it's the year that Burpee Seeds introduced the first commercially available hybrid for home growers. They've been selling to commercial farmers hybrids for a few years before that, but for the home gardener, the big boy showed up for sale for the first time in 1949. So that's why the 1949 date viewed as kind of a distinct cutting off point. That an heirloom, to be an heirloom, had to exist as a distinct variety with distinct characteristics before 1949. The hybrids then, also often referred to as F1. So if you want to know why, we can talk Mendelian genetics afterwards. Don't like genetics 101. But they are human bred. This is an intentional cross between two different varieties where humans have been involved transferring the pollen from one plant to the stigma of the other to fertilize the ovules and make fruit. They're often specific traits, so the two parents that you're going to breed are selected for things such as resistance to particular diseases, or uniformity of fruit or shape of fruit, or resistance to cracking or things like that. But because these are intentional crosses of different varieties, the offspring, the hybrids, aren't going to come true if you plant those seeds. So if you have a beautiful tomato, you want to save the seeds, and it's a hybrid, those babies next year are not going to resemble their parents. So if you want Mendelian genetics again, you can take my class. And how do you want your tomatoes to taste? There is an amazing variety of tomato tastes. It's kind of like wine. And some people want the fruity kind of bold reds, and some people want the lighter whites, and so on, and everything in between. And there are a lot of flavor variations in tomatoes. Some people think they don't really taste much of a difference. Other people are tomato, I don't know, snobs, connoisseurs, something. And it often corresponds to color, not always, and it gets complicated, but in general, the reds and pinks are that kind of classic tomato flavor, that balance of acid and sweet. If you're going a little more orange and yellow end, you tend to find a little less acid flavor. The pH is actually not that different. A lot of people say, oh, I want yellow ones because they're less acidic. Actually, if you measure the acidity, they're usually not that different. They just taste less acid on your tongue and more sweet because they have more sugar. They're often described as kind of fruity. White ones are probably the most mild. There are cream colored ones and white ones. As a matter of fact, Sid has seeds for a cream variety that you might want to try after I finish talking. Green when ripe, I really love. They're kind of tangy and tart, and they're often kind of fruity. They can be a challenge because the change in green to ripe green from unripe green can be very subtle, easy to miss. And then there are the purple and black ones, the ones that people describe as looking like a bruise, maybe. They are probably the most distinctive. They're often kind of smoky or earthy. People describe them as earthy or minerally, or even savory. And a lot of the tomato connoisseurs will say they're the most complex flavors and the most distinctive flavors. And then you get to these. The bicolors, the multicolors, where the flavors can be even more complex and distinctive. Like that's black pineapple on the left. And I really like that one. I like weird tomato. I like the really I like the drama queen tomatoes. So yeah, okay, that's a pretty red tomato, but give me that one. Or that's West Virginia hillbilly potato leaf on the right. So you can get tomatoes that are 3, 4 different colors in there. I guess they're popular. How much time and attention can you devote to them? Tomatoes are fussy. They are demanding. They are prima donnas, especially if you grow the heirlooms. Okay, they can break your heart. I think that's one of the reasons I like them, because they're demanding. People say, what do you like about tomatoes? And I said, well, you know, the part that I like the least is actually eating them. I just like fussing with them. One way to determine how much time and attention they're going to take is, are they determinate or indeterminate? The indeterminate ones that just keep growing are going to require that staking up, tying up, pruning of some type, or buying supports of some type. They're going to require a lot more attention and hands-on work than the determinate ones. Another thing that's going to determine the amount of fussing that they might need is whether they're hybrids or heirlooms. Because a lot of the hybrids have been bred for disease resistance. A lot of the heirlooms have very little disease resistance, if any, or they're a bit resistant to one disease, but not the others. Tomatoes have a lot of diseases, a lot of diseases. Some of them can be devastating. Some of them, the tomato can limp all summer. More about that, tomato talk too. And the last thing to consider really is, do you want to save the seeds? If you'd like to save seeds and have the tomatoes from next year resemble the one you took the seeds from, then you want heirlooms because of the open pollinated. The hybrids across from unlike varieties, those offspring in the next generation are not going to resemble their parents. So I gave you a lot to think about. That means though that the excuse is now go and look through those seed catalogs. Indulge and start circling the ones that sound good and making that list. Or go to Agway and start perusing their display and picking out what you want. Now, I realize that a lot of people probably start with buying a tomato plant already from the greenhouse. And that is perfectly fine. For all sorts of reasons, you might choose to do that. But if you'd rather start at least some of them in your basement, in your sunroom from seed, that's what I'm going to talk about the rest of the time. So if you don't want to hear about that, just read the handouts or something. I will get to preparing them for planting in a while, but it's going to take us about 8 weeks to get to that point. I'm not going to talk that long, but I promise. So I'm going to condense 8 weeks into about 40 minutes or so, and I'm going to do my best here. So let's get started talking about from seed to soil. When do you plant tomato seeds? Roughly 6 to 8 weeks before you're going to put them in outside. It's in a raised bed, it's in the garden soil, 6 to 8 weeks. I traditionally start my tomatoes somewhere between St. Patrick's Day and vernal equinox, so somewhere in the 17 to 20 or 21 of March. I'm a few days late this year, but that's about it. So now, if you haven't started, or within the next few days, you could probably go another week or so. They're just going to be smaller when they go out, but it would still have probably enough time to have a nice sized healthy plant before it goes outside in the real world of the garden. So 6 to 8 weeks before planting outside. When do we plant them outside? Well, remember, tomatoes cannot take frost. They evolved in Central America and the northern part of South America. They evolved in the tropics. They are not perennial here. They get hit with the frost, they're done. So you don't want to plant them out before it's going to frost unless you go to extremes to provide protection and keep them warm. So around here, the last frost date that has only a 10% probability of having another frost, or a 90% probability that the frosts are over, is around May 14th or 15th. Now, yes, it's getting more unpredictable. And yes, it's only going to get worse in unpredictability. But that's historically the last frost date with a 90% probability, no more frost. I also realized that around here, most people wait and plant their tomatoes on Memorial Day weekend. So that's very traditional. And later, that you'll have a frost after that are practically non-existent. So why 6 to 8 weeks to get to that point? Because the tomatoes really go through 2 stages of growth from seed. If you're starting them in your greenhouse, in your basement, whatever. One stage is the first kind of 4 weeks. As they're growing large enough, getting their first true leaves, maybe their second true leaves, and big enough to move into their own larger pots. It's called potting on or transplanting. And then you give them another 4 weeks or so to grow up and to start to harden them off to get them ready, exposure to the outside full time. So let's do the first 4 weeks, starting with the seeds. What do they need? Water, air. They have to be able to absorb oxygen through the roots and the leaves. They need warmth. Remember, they're tropical plants. And the seed itself to germinate needs to be in the dark. So the seed needs to be covered with soil or sharp sand or vermiculite or something, so that the light, exposure to light doesn't inhibit the germination. There are a few vegetables that do need to be exposed to light. Most of them need to be, the seeds need to be covered up. Tomatoes need cover. Oh yeah, and they need something to grow in, right? So some type of medium or potting soil. And people try to avoid the term potting soil for a couple of reasons. One is that you don't put them in garden soil. Not dirt. Because there are all sorts of weed seeds in garden soil. There are all sorts of pests and bacterial pathogens and maybe viruses and things. And you really want a starting medium that is free of any disease or any weeds that could affect their growth. And that's why people even describe it as soil. They technically talk about, seed starting mix or seed starting medium. People also will make a distinction between potting soil and seed starting soil. Because seed starting soil tends to be, the pieces tend to be smaller and more fine. If you look at some potting soils, they'll have larger chunks. And that can be really difficult for those tiny little seedlings to push out of the way and break through the soil to hit the light. So if you're looking for seed starting meat, if you get potting soil, you want to make sure that it's really fine, or maybe you want to sieve out the larger pieces and just use the really fine pieces. You want something that's going to absorb and hold water, and it's going to wet easily, but it's also going to have good drainage, so you don't drown your plants. That doesn't form a crust, because if you do pour water on top, you want it to soak in and not just sit on top. It's lightweight because you grow a lot of flats of plants, they get heavy as you're moving them around all the time. Someone's laughing, I heard that. So seed starting medium. And typically, the advice is to pre-wet it before you ever or 4-packs or whatever you're starting the seeds. I just dump water in a bucket and put in my seed mix and mix it up. And usually I give it more than an hour. I'll just let it set overnight or whatever, so that I have nice moist soil, so that when I'm ready to put it into my 8-packs or 4-packs or whatever, I can pick up a hand of soil, squeeze it and have it hold together, but not have soil or not have water run out of my hand. So moist enough to hold together, but not so wet that it will drip. And then put it in your choose to use. Nice clean containers. Again, you might want to make sure if you used them previously, you might want to wash them with warm soapy water, or maybe soak them in a 10% bleach solution and then rinse them to kill any possible pathogens that are still there. Put it in your pot, tamp it down lightly. This is not brown sugar, people who bake. You're not shoving it in there, right? You're tamping it down lightly just to get rid of air pockets. And leave some space on top. Put your seed in, or seeds. And then those seeds. Now, again, there are a few vegetables that don't want to be covered. Tomatoes, peppers, their relatives do. And the rule is usually 2 to 3 times more soil than the widest dimension of the seed. So half of the width of my little finger. I think in millimeters, so I'm not sure if that makes any scientist. So I don't do inches. I don't know what inches are. You can cover them with very fine potting soil or seed starting medium. I like vermiculite, actually. Really fine vermiculite. And this is my shameless plug for 84 Agway. They have this great new vermiculite that's in these tiny little pieces. And when you put them on top of your soil, immediately. And they're very, very lightweight, and it's very easy for the little seedlings to push them aside and come up and stretch toward the light. Or some people even use contractor sand, builder sand, sharp sand to sprinkle on top. Wet that stuff that you put on top, and I have kind of a dedicated spray bottle that I use to mist it. Word to the wise, don't try to recycle those Windex bottles and things. I did that a few years ago and my plants were not happy. I did. Obviously, even though I scrubbed them out with soap and water, there were still residual chemicals that were not good for the plant. It's where reusing a spray bottle is not a good thing for this purpose. Label, because you think you're going to remember what's in the green pots and what's in the black pots, and 2 days later you won't. So good labels. I just use popsicle sticks. You don't have to go all fancy on the plastic labels or whatever. Cover the container so that it doesn't dry out too fast. If those seeds get moist and then they get dry again, they're dead. Even if you moisten them again, they're not going to survive and come back. I've lost them that way. And then tomatoes, they want somewhere warm. At a minute. So covering, as I mentioned, to retain the moisture. So you can get those clear plastic covers that fit over the flats. People use saran wrap, whatever. Not tight, because you want some air circulation. You don't want it to get really soggy in there. They don't want to be in a rainforest. And heat. If tomatoes are at 70 degrees, they'll germinate, but it'll take a while. If you want them to germinate in a shorter time period, like 3 to 5 days, heat mats. So tomatoes, they're the nightshade family members. So peppers, eggplants, and also the cucurbits. So melons, cucumbers, and summer squash and winter squash. They like the bottom heat. They want their soil temperatures warmer than room temperature to germinate quickly. And if anyone started peppers, you know that even with bottom heat, you can be watching those peppers for 2 weeks, convinced that they're dead. And then after, 18 days, all of a sudden you see life. So peppers are notoriously slow, even with bottom heat. My tomatoes are starting to come up in a 65-degree basement with a heat mat. So once you see them pop up, then you really have to spring into action. So you should be checking those containers every day. Keep them moist. Water that's colder than room temperature will kind of set their development back. So I just get jugs of water and leave them set out so they come to room temperature and use that. Gentle spray or just bottom water. Take your pot, sit it in a tray of water, let it soak it up, and make sure that you're not overwatering. If you're watering from the top and water's running out the bottom, stop. Don't keep going. Those roots have to have access to air. They need oxygen for their chemical life processes, just as we do. So it's really easy to kill plants by overwatering and essentially drowning them. You're suffocating them, just as if I tied your hands about feet. Wow, this is violent. Threw you into the mud. Right? My students are used to, they know that all my analogies are mainly about violence, food, or sex, which amuses college students. Whatever.
The comments of the presenter do not represent that of Peters Township.
Nor WJ, because I don't know what WJ is listening. The comments of the presenter are farmer candy on a bridge. But we're talking about breeding tomatoes. It's biology. So watch for germination. If you do find a lot of moisture gathering on those covers, prop them open. Give them a little airflow. And congratulations, you're a plant parent. There it is, finally up at an exciting moment. Those days that you haven't seen have been the time that it's been busy developing roots. Because that's where it's taking up the moisture. That's where it's taking up the nutrients from the soil. That's where it's living off the food that was in that seed. But think about how tiny a tomato seed is. You can't pack a lot of food in there. So when that plant comes up above the ground, it needs to start making its own food. It needs to start doing photosynthesis. And that literally means light making. It needs light to make food. So first thing, get them under lights. Lights in the windowsill, very tempting. You might think it's bright enough. That tomato probably does not. That marigold does not. Most of the things that you use as houseplants are actually from essentially jungle. They are plants that evolve to grow in low light. So what's successful for your houseplant is not going to be enough for these vegetables that, if you read the recommendations, always at least 6 hours of direct sunlight in a day for most. 8 or more better. So look at them, they're bending toward the light, arranging their chloroplasts to gather as much light as possible. So if you do put them in a bright window, you're probably gonna have to turn them around to make. I am old school. I still grow under fluorescent lights. So those 4-foot shop lights, terrific. You do not have to invest in grow light bulbs. You do not need to spend all that money. If you have the old fluorescent shop lights, and you can still find the tubes, one cool white and one warm white. So the ones that look kind of bluish and the ones that kind of are pinky tan, when you look at the bulb, one bluish one, one pinky tan one in shop light with 2 bulbs, and you have everything you need to be a perfectly successful backyard garden plant starter. Yeah.
How close would the lights be?
I'm getting there.
Okay, thank you.
I'm getting there, and that's a great question. And it's going to depend on whether you do LED shop lights or fluorescent lights. So here's my hint. You don't need these full spectrum grow lights for this. So I'm saving you some money. Now, one of the problems with fluorescent lights is that the intensity at the end of the bulbs is less than in the middle. So that means that for maximal growth, you should be moving your plants around. So at the end, switch them toward the middle, and the ones that are in the middle toward the ends. I'm a nervous mother, so I'm down there with them every day in the basement, checking them. And that's not a bad schedule to put them on, just kind of rotate them. Another reason you don't want heavy potting soil, because you're gonna be doing a lot of lifting. If you are super serious about this, you might want to do LED grow lights. I am, in the interest of time, not really going to say anything more about LED grow lights, besides the fact that they're expensive, really expensive. And if you want to talk more about them, I'm happy to talk with them after the official part of this is finished. But LED shop lights that you can get for 20 bucks for a 4-foot shop light are fine. Actually, they're super energy efficient. They use very little electricity. They don't get very warm. They last forever. And as I said, about 20 bucks at a big box store. White light, the secret is that you need to look for ones that are at least 4,000, 4,000. So the brightness, really the intensity of light is 4,000 lumens or higher. The color temperature, which is connected to the spectrum, the colors, the actual colors in the spectrum that they're putting out, you want 400. If you're in that range, you're fine. And I actually start my very little seedlings, I put under fluorescent lights, and as they get larger, I move them to LEDs, shop lights. And they're doing fine, some beautiful peppers right now. Started them too early, they're too big. How long? At least 12 hours a day. The experts say no more than 18. There are very few plants that actually grow where the light all 24 hours a day. I mean, you don't find tomatoes naturally growing in the Arctic Circle. So they need time too. I just use, there are very inexpensive timers that I plug into a power strip and plug my lights in and set the time. So I don't have to worry about running up and down the steps to turn them on and off. Here's your answer. How close? For fluorescent lights, very close. Closer than you might think. Within a few inches of the top of the seedlings, at least to the point where you transplant them. Then you can move the lights a little further away. LEDs is a little trickier because that light tends to be more intense and you may need to put the LED lights a little further away. And that's one you might have to experiment with. Fluorescent lights, just a few inches. So I mentioned move the lights up and down. You can do that. That's not my setup, but it looks just like that. I just use chains and S hooks. If you don't want to mess with the chains and the S hooks, then you could put the pots themselves on something. You could lift them up on boards or bricks or whatever, and just adjust the distance between the plants and the lights. Either lights down or plants up. Oh yeah, and get them off the heat mat. Once they've germinated, they don't need that bottom heat anymore. And they should be fine in what we would consider probably comfortable room temperature, 60 to 70 in the day, and they can cool down a bit at night, just outside. Keep the soil moist. And when they, especially when they get their first true leaves that look like the adult plant leaves, then, if not before, I start giving them some very diluted fertilizer. Again, I let my water sit to room temperature. And I usually put it in a bucket or some other container that has a large surface area, so chlorine gas and things can escape. And I'll let it sit for a day or so. Don't use softened water. It's very, very salty. Not good for the plants. So I start them off with a very weak fertilizer solution, usually about 1 to 10 diluted. So whatever is recommended on the container, I do 1/10 of that. And then when they get big enough to transplant after 4 weeks or so, then I will start giving it more fertilizer. It's a bigger plant. It needs more nutrients to sustain its growth. And then I'll go to maybe 1 to 4 dilution. So I'm never giving them full strength. What do I give mine? I give them a combination of fish emulsion and seaweed extract. That's going to contain the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK, that are the 3 major nutrients, but it's also going to have the secondary nutrients, it's going to have the micronutrients, especially the seaweed extract is going to have a lot of growth hormones and things that really promote the health and the growth of your plants. So you can buy them separately, or you can actually buy solutions that are a combination of them. And yeah, and the fish fertilizer does smell a little fishy, but the odor does dissipate fairly quickly. Good air circulation. Some people, if they're growing a lot of transplants, will actually put a fan on them. I don't, but you really don't want it, you don't want it tropical in there. You want basically comfortable room humidity. And if they are doing well, you will see those seed leaves, the cotyledon leaves that don't really look anything like the adult plant. will come out first, and then the first true leaves will resemble the actual full-grown plant. Congratulations, that's a major milestone. That's like your kid, your toddler's walking now, right? One of these big transitions in development. When they hit that point, they're ready to go into a bigger pot, more space. And the technical term is pricking out. So notice that that person's not reaching in there and grabbing it by the stem and pulling it out. You're going to squish the stem, you're going to break the stem, going to harm the plant. Frankly, I would let that grow a little longer. I think that's a little young to prick out and pot on, but it's a nice picture that illustrated other concepts, including the fact that you're using something like a spoon or a little scoop to get the soil and remove of that plant. I'm trying to minimize the root disturbance. But if you do disturb the roots even a little, enough to see them, they should look pretty impressive at that point. So you want to give those roots more space to grow. You want to give them better nutrition to support the growth of the plant. You want to stimulate their growth. So a little disturbance isn't a bad thing. It stimulates growth. Give them a little challenge. So they have to rise to meet it. And then pot them on or transplant them. So larger, deeper pot. So this is where you might take them out of those little 4-packs and move them into a 2-inch diameter pot. I put paper in the bottom just to keep the soil from coming out. So I just use old paper grocery bags, just torn into pieces, stuffed in the bottom. Some people will put perlite or sand or something in the bottom for drainage. I haven't, and I've been fine. And then moist soil. And that's what your little pricked out plant should look like. And that is a very nice looking tomato there with its cotyledons, its first leaves, and then its true leaves, and it's starting its second set of true leaves. Has a nice thick stem. It just looks really healthy, and it's ready to girl pants, I guess, and move into a bigger home. So put that soil in that pot, poke a hole in there, put the pricked out seedling in, pull the soil up around it, and water it in gently with diluted fertilizer water. You can put tomatoes deeper than the soil line. That's actually a good thing, because that whatever part of that stem is buried, that's stimulating more root growth. And that's going to mean when it gets into the ground in your garden, that it's going to be able to take up more moisture. It's going to be more drought resistant. So on the stem. So what can go wrong? Lots of things. I'm going to touch on the 3 most common things that I've had growing seedlings in my basement for the garden. And probably the most common is they don't have enough light. And they have gotten leggy or etiolated is the proper technical scientific term. They're stretching toward the light, or they might be overcrowded, as these are as well. Notice there's really thin stems for their height. Or the temperature's too high and they're actually growing faster. So they're getting tall and skinny and they're having this growth burst without having the bulk. That's a sign, move them closer to the light. For those, divide them up, give them more root space. They're competing with each other for nutrients. Another common problem is they're too wet. And everything looks fine one day, and the next day they have all bent over at the soil line. That's called damping off, and it's caused by a fungus. Why do you have fungal growth? You have too much moisture, you don't have good air circulation, you're overwatering them. You don't have enough holes in the bottom of the pot, so you have poor drainage. Or the soil's too cold is another problem that would promote fungus mold growth. So damping off can be a real hard. The easiest way to prevent that is just don't get them too wet or too cold. And the other problem that I've had with tomatoes is a discoloration of the leaves, which actually turns out to be not a huge problem, but it's not going pale. If your leaves are pale green instead of dark, vibrant green, they probably don't have enough nitrogen to support leaf growth. If you're feeding them a good diluted fertilizer, that shouldn't be a problem. What can be a problem, even if there's enough phosphorus in the soil and in the fertilizer, is that they have problems taking it up into the plant. It's fine, but the plant can't take it up. It's like you have plenty of food in the refrigerator, but you can't eat it. And they turn purple underneath. And it can be really dramatic purple. And usually, if you move those plants into a warmer condition, or I'd probably give them maybe some fresh soil, because soil that's too acid or too acidic can cause this. But what I found is, even if they're very purple underneath, once I start hardening them off and taking them outside and getting them ready to be planted, they recover very quickly, and I don't really see issues with this. But it is very frightening if you're don't know what it is and you see them turning purple. They can also turn browns or bronze from a potassium deficiency. So a good fertilizer, consistent diluted fertilizer, you shouldn't have these problems. Unless it's too cold and you might get the purple. And guess what? It's the beginning of May already. That time went fast. They're nice and big, they're healthy, they're strong, they're dark green, they're thick stems, they're ready to transition. Process is called hardening off. A gradual introduction to the outside environment. I liken this to getting ready to go on your summer vacation at the beach. And you're outside for a little while in the day and you put some sunscreen on and so forth. You don't make the mistake of going from your winter skin tone to being on the beach for 6 hours in one day, because just like you, the plants can get very sunburned and can be very damaging. So the advice is, about a week before you start this, start kind of toughening them up a little. Don't give them quite so much water. Don't fertilize them. And you might even want to lower the temperature at night if you could. Maybe move them to a cooler spot and toughen them up a little bit. And then after that, kind of pre-week. So this is kind of like going to the gym to get the bikini body back before you actually go to the beach. Right? Then start taking them outside, just for a short time, and not in direct sunlight. So I literally put mine in full shade for an hour or so the first day. And then they go back to the basement in their protected land. And the next day they might come out for 2 hours. And so that day by day, they're outside for a longer time period. And it gets a little brighter. So you might move them from full shade to dappled shade under a tree. And by the end of that week or 10 days, they're out in the full sun. So it's that gradual acclimation. So when they're actually out there all the time from now on in the soil, they're not in shock. So after about 7 to 10 days, they should be ready to go in the ground or in the container, in the raised bed. But it's plant time. Now we're in mid to late May, ready to get our hands really dirty. So minimize the shock. A lot of on an overcast day or a cloudy day, or even if it's drizzling rain, or late afternoon or evening, so that their exposure to those harsh high light conditions is minimal the first day or so. A couple of feet apart. I actually plant mine about 18 inches apart because you want good air circulation. So we'll see in June that a lot of diseases are linked to dampness being held on those leaves and promoting the growth of bacterial and molds. dig your hole, and into the hole, fertilizer, nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus and potassium. What do I use? I'm a tomato tone fan, but there are lots of fertilizers. The important thing for tomato fertilizers is that the first number, the nitrogen, is relatively low, and the phosphorus and the potassium are higher. They are the nutrients that the tomato needs for good flowers and fruit. Okay, so you can kind of think of it literally as leaves, flowers, and fruit. Or leaves, roots, and flowers and fruit. But that's not all they need. Yeah, they need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. But there's like calcium and sulfur and magnesium. There are micronutrients that they only need a tiny amount of. Copper and boron and iron, and those come from things like worm poop, worm castings. Yeah, it's expensive, I know. I put about a handful per tomato hole. I also put in compost, and that's usually a double handful at least, sometimes a shovelful. I'm a make your own compost person. But between the worm castings and the compost, you're getting all those little micronutrients that really support the growth of the plant. That fertilizers often don't include. Often fertilizers are just plant them deep. Maximize root development, minimize drought stress. So a lot of people actually dig a trench and put in the tomatoes sideways. Bury the stem and just let a couple of sets of leaves outside. That's all. They will be very happy. And water them in with dilute fertilizer. Get them off to a great start. I know water gets on the leaves when it rains. But don't splash any more water than you have to. That will get disease organisms out of the soil and onto the leaves. And you don't want that situation if you can avoid it. So layer mulch over it. Chopped up straw, leaves you saved from the fall, grass clippings, or a combination. It'll retain the moisture, it'll suppress weeds, it'll keep soil organisms from splashing up. And guess what? It's in the ground, it's planted. It's time to grow. It's time to think about things like, how am I going to support that plant? If you plant it indeterminate, in a shockingly short time. And guess what? It's also time for me to quit. I did it, Sid.
You did it.
I did it, Sid. So I'm going to be back here on Tuesday, June the 3rd, same time, same place, I believe. To talk about that, getting them to that point. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to wait until June the 3rd if you have questions. First of all, I'm going to hang out here. I mean, they're not going to throw me out until about 8 o'clock. So I have a habit of being the last person thrown out of the library besides the staff. So I'm happy to hang around. But if you don't want to hang around, have something else to do tonight, you can stalk me on Facebook and by email. So chicken